October 1945. A converted school building near Frankfurt, now serving as a processing center for German military personnel. The autumn sun slanted through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden floor. In the hallway, a young American lieutenant approached a cluster of German women waiting to be processed for release. Among them stood Hauptmann Erika Hartmann, 32 years old, formerly a senior administrative officer in the Luftwaffe Communications Division. She wore what remained of her uniform. The insignia had been removed per occupation regulations, but the cut and quality of the fabric still marked her as someone who had held rank. As the American officer passed, he did something that made her freeze mid-breath. He met her eyes, brought his hand crisply to his brow in a formal military salute, and said simply, "Ma'am." Then he continued down the hallway, leaving Hartmann staring after him with an expression of such profound confusion that the woman beside her asked if she was ill. Hartmann could not immediately answer. She was trying to process an interaction that violated every principle of military protocol she had learned in 8 years of service. An officer of the victorious army had just saluted her. A defeated enemy, a woman, someone whose nation lay in ruins and whose military no longer legally existed. The gesture made no sense within any framework she possessed for understanding military relations, gender dynamics, or the behavior of conquerors toward the conquered. This moment, repeated in countless variations across occupied Germany in the final months of 1945 and throughout 1946, represented something far more complex than simple military courtesy. It was the collision between two fundamentally different understandings of what military rank meant, what respect meant, what women were, and what obligations existed between human beings even across the deepest divides of conflict and ideology. For German women officers confronting these unexpected salutes from American soldiers, the experience triggered a cascade of realizations about the nature of the system they had served and the system that had defeated it. The Third Reich's relationship with military women was paradoxical from its inception. Nazi ideology held that women's natural and highest role was as mothers and homemakers, creators and nurturers of the racial community. Yet the demands of total war required women's labor in roles far beyond the domestic sphere. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of German women served in auxiliary military positions, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen in communications, the Luftwaffenhelferinnen in anti-aircraft operations, administrators, nurses, and technical specialists of various kinds. These women wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and performed functions essential to the war effort. Some rose to positions of significant responsibility, managing offices, coordinating complex logistics, or supervising other personnel. Yet they existed in a strange liminal space within the military hierarchy. They held ranks, but these ranks were always qualified, always auxiliary. They commanded respect, but always with the implicit understanding that their authority derived from and remained subordinate to male military leadership. They were officers, but not quite officers in the same sense as men. This ambiguity manifested in hundreds of small protocols. Male officers generally saluted female officers of higher rank, but the gesture carried different weight than salutes exchanged between men. It acknowledged position without fully recognizing authority. It was a salute to the uniform and the organizational structure rather than to the person wearing the uniform. More fundamentally, these women served a regime whose foundational ideology held that hierarchy was natural, necessary, and morally correct. The Nazi system organized human beings into multiple overlapping hierarchies of race, of rank, of party membership, of proven loyalty to the regime. Respect flowed downward as a kind of gift from superior to inferior, acknowledgement of satisfactory performance or useful service. It did not flow upward except in the highly ritualized forms of deference that subordinates owed to superiors. And it certainly did not flow across the chasm separating victor from vanquished. In the Nazi understanding of military relations, The defeated owed respect to the victorious, never the reverse. Conquered peoples were to be dominated, exploited, or in some cases exterminated, but never accorded the courtesies that existed between equals. The American military operated under a different philosophy, one woven through with contradictions and imperfect applications, but nevertheless distinct in its fundamental premises. The American salute was not primarily a gesture of deference from inferior to superior. It was a mutual acknowledgement of professional status, a ritual that recognized both parties as members of an institution larger than either individual. Officers saluted each other regardless of relative rank when meeting for the first time or in formal circumstances. Enlisted personnel saluted officers, and officers returned those salutes, not as a gift to inferiors, but as a recognition that respect for the institution required respect for the rituals that bound it together. This understanding of the salute reflected a broader American conception of respect as something owed to positions and roles, rather than to personal dominance within a hierarchy. An American private might have little personal regard for a particular lieutenant, but he saluted the rank and what it represented within the military structure. An American general returned salutes to privates not because he feared them or needed their approval, but because the ritual acknowledged their shared participation in the institution. This conception was never perfectly realized. American military culture contained its own hierarchies, prejudices, and power imbalances, but it established a baseline understanding that respect for institutional roles was distinct from personal dominance or submission. When this American understanding encountered defeated German military personnel, it produced interactions that German officers found deeply disorienting. American regulations regarding the treatment of former enemy officers were complex and evolved throughout the occupation period, but they generally maintained that former military personnel should be treated with correctness, even in defeat. This meant, in practice, that American officers sometimes saluted German officers when meeting them in official capacities, particularly during the processing and release procedures that dominated the immediate post-war months. These salutes were not expressions of approval or forgiveness. They were mechanical applications of the principle that military courtesy should be maintained even toward former enemies, that the institutional rituals of military professionalism transcended the temporary condition of enmity. For German male officers, these salutes were surprising but not incomprehensible. Military tradition included protocols for respectful treatment of defeated enemies, the surrender rituals, the acknowledgement of brave opponents, the courtesies sometimes extended in prisoner exchanges. These German officers could contextualize American salutes within existing frameworks, even if the American application of these courtesies seemed more extensive than German practice would have allowed. But for German women officers, the American salutes carried an additional layer of cognitive dissonance. They challenged not only expectations about victor-vanquished relations, but also fundamental assumptions about gender, authority, and respect. Oberleutnant Greta Schneider, who had coordinated supply logistics for Luftwaffe communications units throughout the war, later described her first encounter with an American salute in testimony preserved in post-war Allied intelligence records. Schneider was being processed for release at a facility in Bavaria when an American captain approached her with questions about her former unit's structure. Before beginning the interview, the captain saluted. Schneider stood frozen, unsure how to respond. In the German system, she would have returned the salute automatically if it came from a military superior in her own chain of command. But this was an enemy officer, and she was no longer technically in active service. After an awkward pause, she returned the salute hesitantly. The captain proceeded with his interview professionally, consulting her expertise about communication, protocols, and supply routes as if she were a colleague, rather than a former enemy. Schneider later wrote that the interaction left her in a state of confusion that lasted for days. The salute implied recognition of her former military status, acknowledgement that her rank and position had meant something. But this contradicted everything she understood about the status of the defeated. Germany had lost totally unconditionally. The regime she had served stood revealed as having committed atrocities of unimaginable scale. She personally felt shame about her participation in the military apparatus of such a regime. Even though her own role had been administrative rather than directly involved in combat or atrocities. Given this context, she expected to be treated as a defeated enemy at best, possibly as a criminal. Instead, this American officer had saluted her and then consulted her professional expertise as if her knowledge and experience retained value despite her service to a defeated and morally bankrupt regime. The gender dimension of these encounters added another layer of complexity. German women officers existed in a military system that never fully accepted their presence. They were necessary, valued for their contributions, but always marked as exceptional cases, temporary expedients required by wartime emergency. Many had internalized this ambiguity, accepting positions of authority while simultaneously believing that military leadership was naturally masculine. They had learned to exercise command while maintaining performative deference to male authority, to be competent without being threatening, to accept respect for their positions while understanding that this respect had limits that did not apply to male officers. American military culture in 1945 was hardly free of gender discrimination. Women served in auxiliary roles in the American military as well, and they faced significant barriers to recognition and advancement. The idea that women could or should hold combat commands was almost universally rejected. Yet American military culture possessed a tradition of formal courtesy toward women that existed in tension with and sometimes overrode hierarchical considerations. American officers were raised in a culture that taught men to show certain courtesies to women regardless of relative status, holding doors, standing when women entered rooms, and yes, sometimes saluting women officers even when strict military protocol might not require it. When these American cultural habits met German women officers, they produced interactions that seemed almost surreal to the German women. An American sergeant might salute a former German woman officer while processing her release papers, combining military courtesy with culturally ingrained gender courtesy in a way that made no distinction between her status as a defeated enemy and her status as a woman officer. An American lieutenant might offer a chair to a German woman captain before beginning an interview, then salute before departing, as if she were simultaneously a prisoner to be questioned and a lady to be treated with courtesy. Hauptmann Margaret Lindemann, a senior administrative officer who had managed personnel records for an entire Luftwaffe district, later wrote about the cognitive dissonance these interactions produced. Lindemann had been a committed National Socialist, a true believer who had joined the party before the war and had risen through the ranks in part through demonstrated political loyalty. She expected, upon capture, to be treated harshly as a representative of the Nazi regime. Instead, American officers treated her with a formal correctness that she found almost maddening in its refusal to acknowledge what seemed to her the obvious moral hierarchy between victors and vanquished, between a regime fighting for liberation and a regime exposed as genocidal. One particular incident crystallized her confusion. She was being escorted between facilities by an American military police lieutenant when they encountered a group of displaced persons, former concentration camp inmates, being transported in the opposite direction. Lindemann felt a wave of shame and horror, confronting physically the human consequences of the regime she had served. She expected the American lieutenant to acknowledge this moment, to perhaps comment on the contrast between her treatment and the treatment these victims had received under German authority. Instead, the lieutenant simply continued the escort professionally, and when they reached their destination, he saluted before turning her over to the facility staff. That salute, Lindemann wrote, haunted her for months. It seemed to suggest that the American lieutenant maintained a distinction between her, as an individual former officer, and the regime she had served. It suggested that military courtesy could exist even across the vast moral chasm separating the Allied cause from the Nazi cause. It suggested that the American officer held to certain protocols of professional interaction regardless of his personal feelings about the Nazi regime or her participation in it. This professionalism was, in its way, more devastating than overt hostility would have been. Hostility she could have understood, and perhaps even felt she deserved. Courtesy forced her to confront the possibility that the American system possessed a kind of moral confidence that allowed it to maintain civilized protocols even toward defeated enemies, that it did not need to dominate or degrade its captives to prove its victory. The symbolic power of the salute accumulated through repetition. German women officers processed through occupation facilities encountered American salutes dozens of times, upon arrival, during interviews, at release. Each salute reinforced the same message. The Americans recognized their former military status, acknowledged it through formal courtesy, and maintained professional protocols regardless of the war's outcome. This consistency was itself remarkable. German military courtesy, even at its most correct, had always been conditional, dependent on the relative status of the parties involved, and subject to suspension when dealing with racial enemies or defeated foes. American military courtesy, while imperfect and inconsistently applied, nevertheless maintained a baseline of formal respect that seemed to function almost mechanically, independent of personal feelings or political circumstances. This mechanical quality initially seemed to many German women like cultural naivety or even weakness. Surely, they thought, a truly strong military would not waste courtesy on defeated enemies. Surely the victors earned the right to abandon formal protocols and deal with the vanquished however they saw fit. The American insistence on maintaining military courtesies seemed to reflect the same kind of impractical idealism that Nazi propaganda had always attributed to democracies: soft, sentimental, unwilling to embrace the harsh realities of power and domination. But this interpretation became increasingly difficult to maintain as the occupation continued. The Americans were not weak. Their military had crushed German forces. Their industrial capacity dwarfed Germany's. Their logistical systems functioned with a efficiency that made German quartermasters weep with envy. Their soldiers, far from being the racially inferior mongrels of Nazi propaganda, proved disciplined and effective. The American military was formidable precisely while maintaining courtesies toward defeated enemies. This correlation forced a reconsideration. Perhaps the courtesies were not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength. Perhaps a military culture that maintained professional protocols, even toward enemies, was stronger, not weaker, than one that required degradation of opponents to establish dominance. Lieutenant Frieda Kellermann, a signals officer who had managed encrypted communications for Wehrmacht units on the Eastern Front, articulated this realization in remarkable detail during post-war interviews. Kellermann had witnessed the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners by German forces, had seen the systematic degradation and murder of captured Red Army soldiers. She had accepted this treatment as necessary given the ideological nature of the conflict. The Eastern Front was an existential struggle between incompatible worldviews, and such struggles allowed no room for sentimentality about enemy prisoners. When she was captured by American forces during the final collapse, she expected similar treatment. Instead, she received correct, if not warm, handling, adequate food, medical care for her injuries, and eventually processing for release. During this processing, an American major saluted her before beginning an interview about communications protocols. Kellermann returned the salute automatically, then sat through the interview in a state of distraction. She kept thinking about the Soviet prisoners she had seen, about the treatment they had received, about the contrast with her own treatment. The Americans had every reason to be harsh. German forces had killed hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, had committed atrocities throughout occupied Europe, had proven themselves ruthless enemies. Yet here was this American major, saluting her as if she were a fellow professional rather than a defeated enemy who represented a regime responsible for starting the war and committing genocide. The realization that followed was painful but inescapable. The Nazi regime had justified its brutality as necessary strength, as the willingness to do what softer peoples would not do. Yet the softer Americans had proven stronger. They had won the war while maintaining standards of conduct that the Nazi regime had abandoned. They saluted defeated enemies, treated prisoners according to international law, maintained institutional courtesies even toward those who had tried to kill them. This was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, one rooted in confidence rather than fear, in institutional discipline rather than personal dominance, in a belief that maintaining civilized standards was possible even in war, and that abandoning those standards was not strength, but barbarism. The salute became a physical embodiment of this alternative philosophy. Each time an American officer saluted a German woman officer, he enacted a small ritual that said, "Your humanity is recognized even in defeat. Your former professional status is acknowledged even though your regime has fallen." Courtesy between military personnel can exist even across the deepest political and moral divides. These messages contradicted everything the Nazi system had taught about the nature of conflict, the relationship between victor and vanquished, and thoroughly of strength in human relations. For younger German women officers, those whose ideological formation had been less complete or whose commitment to Nazism had been more circumstantial than ideological, these salutes sometimes prompted rapid reorientation. They had joined military service for various reasons: patriotism, desire for meaningful work, escape from limited civilian opportunities, family tradition. They had served competently without necessarily embracing Nazi ideology in its full racial and authoritarian dimensions. For these women, American courtesies confirmed doubts they had been afraid to articulate during the war. Perhaps the Nazi system had been wrong not just strategically, but morally. Perhaps respect and courtesy were not signs of weakness, but of civilizational strength. Perhaps the rigid hierarchies and brutal domination that characterized Nazi military culture were not necessary for military effectiveness, but were in fact impediments to the kind of adaptive, resilient military culture the Americans displayed. Lieutenant Anna Brandt, a meteorologist who had provided weather forecasting for Luftwaffe operations, later wrote that the American salutes she received during processing fundamentally altered her understanding of military professionalism. Brandt had been trained to see military effectiveness as flowing from rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. Respect flowed downward from superiors as reward for obedience. Subordinates owed deference and obedience upward. This was the iron law of military organization, she had believed. The American system seemed to violate this law. American officers saluted subordinates, returning their salutes, not as a gift, but as an institutional obligation. American soldiers showed initiative and independent judgment within their assigned roles. American military culture maintained courtesies even toward enemies. Yet this apparently soft, courteous, less hierarchical system had proven more effective in practice than the rigid German system. American forces adapted quickly to changing battlefield conditions. American logistics functioned reliably even in chaotic circumstances. American soldiers fought effectively without requiring the harsh discipline that characterized German military culture. The American military won while maintaining standards that the German military had abandoned as impractical softness. This outcome suggested that perhaps the relationship between respect, courtesy, discipline, and military effectiveness was more complex than Nazi ideology acknowledged. Perhaps treating people with respect, even enemies, was compatible with and maybe even necessary for sustained military excellence. The gender dimension of this realization carried particular weight. German women officers had internalized the paradox of their position, valued for their contributions but never fully accepted as legitimate military leaders, exercising authority while maintaining deference to male superiority. The American salutes troubled this internalized hierarchy. When an American male officer saluted a German woman officer, he enacted a ritual that suggested professional equality even across gender lines. That suggested a woman's military rank commanded recognition comparable to a man's. This was not because American military culture had achieved gender equality. It had not, and American women in military service faced their own barriers and discrimination. But American military culture possessed traditions of formal courtesy that could override some hierarchical and gender considerations, creating moments where professional recognition transcended personal or cultural prejudices. Some German women officers found this aspect of American salutes particularly troubling because it challenged not just their understanding of victor-vanquished relations, but their understanding of their own relationship to military authority. If women could legitimately hold military rank deserving of salutes even from male officers of a victorious army, then perhaps the Nazi insistence that women's military service was always exceptional and auxiliary had been wrong. Perhaps women could be military professionals in the same sense as men, deserving of the same professional courtesies and institutional respect. This realization was not universally welcome. Some German women officers had accepted and even embraced their auxiliary status, seeing it as appropriately balancing women's contributions to the war effort with traditional gender roles. For these women, American courtesies that seemed to recognize them as full military professionals rather than auxiliaries were dissonant, suggesting gender possibilities they had not embraced and were not sure they wanted to embrace. Others, who had chafed against the limitations of their auxiliary status while serving in the German military, found in American courtesies a validation they had not expected, a beidbeinintuitive suggestion that their professional competence and military rank could be recognized as legitimate rather than as temporary expedients. The processing of German military personnel through occupation facilities involved thousands of individual interactions, creating a laboratory where different cultural assumptions about respect, hierarchy, and courtesy collided. American personnel varied widely in how they applied military courtesies to former enemy officers. Some strictly maintained protocols, saluting any former officer regardless of gender or nationality. Others applied courtesies more selectively, guided by personal feelings about the defeated enemy or informal guidance from superiors. Still others combined military and civilian courtesy traditions in inconsistent ways, saluting a German woman officer while also holding doors and offering chairs in ways that emphasized her femininity rather than her military status. This inconsistency itself was revealing. It suggested that American courtesies toward German women officers emerged not from a coherent policy, but from the interaction of multiple cultural traditions: military professionalism, gender courtesy, democratic egalitarianism, Christian ethics, and individual moral intuitions. The result was a pattern of behavior that seemed almost incoherent from a German perspective, trained to expect rigid protocols and clear hierarchies, but which reflected the messy pluralism of American culture, with its multiple overlapping and sometimes contradictory value systems. Yet even with this inconsistency, certain patterns held. German women officers were rarely deliberately humiliated or degraded by American personnel. They received courtesies with some regularity, even if those courtesies were not universally or uniformly applied. They were processed for release according to protocols that acknowledged their former military status, even while requiring denazification procedures. They encountered, in other words, a system that maintained basic standards of correct treatment, even toward former enemies, even toward women from a military culture that had not fully accepted women's military participation, even toward representatives of a regime that had committed unprecedented atrocities. The cumulative effect of these encounters was a forced reassessment of fundamental assumptions. For German women officers who paid attention, who allowed themselves to think deeply about what these courtesies implied, the American salutes prompted questions that undermined the ideological foundations of the regime they had served. If respect could be extended to defeated enemies, then perhaps might did not make right in the absolute way Nazi ideology claimed. If courtesy could cross gender lines in military contexts, then perhaps women's capability for military professionalism was greater than Nazi ideology acknowledged. If a less rigidly hierarchical military culture could prove more effective than German authoritarianism, then perhaps hierarchy was a tool rather than a natural law. If Americans maintained civilized standards even toward those who had tried to kill them, then perhaps civilization itself was stronger than barbarism, rather than a weakness that barbarism would inevitably overcome. These realizations did not happen instantly or universally. Some German women officers remained committed to Nazi ideology despite their experiences, reframing American courtesies as naivety or propaganda rather than as evidence of an alternative value system. Others accepted better treatment gratefully, without interrogating its implications for their previous beliefs. Many existed in states of confusion and ambivalence, unable to fully reconcile their experiences with their prior ideological commitments, but also unable to ignore the evidence that something important about their understanding of human relations had been mistaken. But, for those who allowed the questions to unfold, the American salutes became catalysts for profound ideological transformation. Each salute was a small ritual enactment of respect across the deepest divides. Each salute said, "You were our enemy, but you are human. You served a regime we fought to destroy, but you retained dignity. You were defeated, but defeat does not erase your professional identity." These messages, repeated through hundreds of individual interactions, accumulated into a demonstration that alternatives to Nazi authoritarianism were not just theoretically possible but practically achievable, that societies could function effectively while maintaining courtesies even toward enemies, that human dignity could be recognized even across barriers of conflict and ideology. The immediate post-war period was chaotic and often brutal. Millions of displaced persons struggled to survive. German cities lay in ruins. Food shortages created mass suffering, and the exposure of Nazi atrocities generated rage and desire for revenge. Within this context, the maintenance of military courtesies toward former German officers was a small thing, easily overlooked amid the larger dramas of occupation and reconstruction. Yet for the individuals involved, these courtesies carried enormous symbolic weight. They represented the difference between a peace based solely on the domination of victor over vanquished and a peace that maintained some recognition of shared humanity even between former enemies. German women officers who received American salutes carried those memories forward into the Reconstruction period. Many participated in building the new democratic Germany, bringing to that work both practical skills and hard-won insights about the differences between authoritarian and democratic systems. Some became educators, teaching new generations of Germans about the failures of Nazism and the values that should guide a rebuilt nation. Others withdrew from public life, too scarred by their experiences to engage fully with the new order. Some few remained committed to Nazi ideology, preserving in private their belief that the regime had been right, even if it had been defeated. But many experienced the American courtesies, including the salutes as part of a larger re-education, not the formal denazification programs mandated by occupation authorities, but an informal education conducted through thousands of small interactions that demonstrated alternative ways of organizing human relationships. They learned, through being treated with correct courtesy by victors who had every reason to be harsh, that strength and courtesy were compatible, that discipline and respect could coexist, that professional protocols could transcend personal and political enmities. The American soldier who saluted a German woman officer in October 1945 probably did not think of himself as conducting an ideological intervention. He was following his training, maintaining military protocols, perhaps also following cultural habits about courtesy toward women. The gesture was routine, almost mechanical, requiring no particular moral reflection or conscious decision beyond the application of standard courtesies. Yet this very mechanical quality gave the gesture its power. It demonstrated that courtesy could be institutionalized, that respect could be built into routine protocols rather than being dependent on personal feelings or political circumstances. For the German woman officer who received that salute, standing in the ruins of her nation and the wreckage of her beliefs, the gesture carried profound meaning. It said that she retained human dignity despite her nation's defeat and her regime's crimes. It said that professional competence and military service meant something even when stripped from the context of the Nazi regime. It said that the victors possessed enough confidence and civilizational strength to maintain courtesies even toward defeated enemies. These were difficult messages to receive. They required confronting the failures of the system she had served while also accepting unexpected recognition from the system that had defeated it. The tears that some German women officers shed upon receiving American salutes came from the same deep place as the tears of wounded prisoners receiving medical care without regard to rank. They were tears of recognition, the painful acknowledgement that fundamental assumptions about human relations had been wrong, that alternatives existed, that the rigid hierarchies and brutal domination of Nazi culture had not been natural laws but choices, and those choices had proven morally bankrupt and practically inferior to the democratic alternative. In the longer view of history, these individual moments of courtesy across the divide of war contributed to the successful democratization of Germany. Democracy could not be imposed purely through force or law. It required a transformation of culture, a reimagining of how human beings related to authority, hierarchy, and each other. This transformation happened through multiple channels: formal denazification, economic reconstruction, political reforms, generational change. But it also happened through small human interactions that demonstrated democratic values in practice. The American soldiers saluting a German woman officer enacted democratic respect for professional roles and human dignity even toward former enemies. The German woman officer processing that salute experienced, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be recognized as a human being with inherent worth rather than as a position in a hierarchy whose value was contingent on loyalty and service to the regime. This is what democracy offers at its best. Not perfect equality or the absence of hierarchy, but the recognition that every person possesses dignity that commands respect regardless of their status. That protocols of courtesy and respect can be institutionalized rather than being dependent on the whims of the powerful. That strength and civility are compatible rather than contradictory. The salute given to a defeated enemy officer, particularly a woman officer from a military culture that had never fully accepted women's military service, embodied these democratic principles. It said that respect was not a gift from the powerful to the weak, but a recognition of shared humanity across all divides. The German women officers who received these salutes went forward into a transformed Germany, carrying the memory of those unexpected courtesies. Some embraced the democratic values those courtesies represented, becoming advocates for the new order. Others struggled with ambivalence, grateful for the courtesy but uncertain about its implications. A few rejected the experience, clinging to the familiar authoritarian worldview despite evidence of its failures. But all of them had been confronted with the reality that alternatives to Nazi authoritarianism existed and functioned, that courtesy and strength were compatible, that respect could cross even the deepest divides of war and ideology. In the ruins of 1945, amid the physical and moral wreckage of Nazi Germany, small gestures of courtesy carried revolutionary implications. An American officer's salute to a German woman officer said more powerfully than any speech or document that human dignity persisted even in defeat, that professional respect transcended political circumstances, that civilized relations between peoples were possible even after total war. These lessons, learned through small interactions repeated thousands of times across occupied Germany, became part of the foundation on which democratic Germany was rebuilt. Not the only foundation or even the most important, but one strand in the complex weaving of new cultural patterns that would replace the authoritarian hierarchies of the Nazi past with the more egalitarian, more humane, if still imperfect relationships of democratic society. The sound of heels clicking together as a German woman officer returned, an unexpected American salute echoed forward through history. A small acoustic marker of the moment when one world ended and another began to take shape. When courtesy crossed the chasm of war and demonstrated that even enemies retained humanity, that even the defeated deserved dignity, that strength and civilization were not opposites but essential complements in building a world worth inhabiting.